Hello, my name is Michael Robertson, and welcome to our foray into family history. In this episode, I would like to talk a little about my third great grandparents on my father's side of the family, and that would be my great 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 grandfather, Joseph Robertson, and his wife, Rosanna Armstrong. Now, they were both born in the late 18th century, and in the early 19th century were both living in the vicinity of Glasgow, Scotland. Now, we may not know much about the parents of either of them, but I would like to take a look at the record and see what we can find out about them and their children, and maybe a little bit about what their life was like in Glasgow at that time. Perhaps the best place to begin this genealogical journey is with information that can be found in an old family Bible. In this Bible, there's recorded the names of Joseph Robertson, his wife Rosanna Armstrong, and their 12 children. This Bible records the dates of their birth and, in many cases, the dates of their death. Now, this Bible does note that the information was first written down in January of 1862. The information that it contains has Joseph Robertson being born in November of 1796 and his wife Rosanna Armstrong being born in April of 1798. All of their children were born between the years 1818 and 1844. So with that, we'd like to see what other information we can find about this family in the records. The earliest piece of information that we can find is a record of marriage in 1817 of Joseph Robertson and Rosanna Armstrong. This record was found in the Barony Parish Church records. It notes that Joseph was a collier working in a coal mine, and that they were living in Parkhead, in the Parkhead region of Glasgow. Another important piece of information that we have is a record from the first census that was conducted in Scotland in the year of 1841. These census data show that the family at this time was living in Palmady, which is another area in the vicinity of Glasgow, not far from Parkhead. It shows Joseph and Rosanna were living with their children, John, Thomas, Joseph Jr., be known as Joseph Scott, George, William, David, and James. Now, unfortunately, this record and the record in the Bible show that the first 4 daughters that were born to Joseph and Rosanna died before reaching the age of 2 years old. This record indicates that Joseph Sr. was born in Lanarkshire and that Rosanna was born in Ireland. Their first son, John, the record shows John being born in Scotland, but not in Lanarkshire. The other children were all born in Lanarkshire in Scotland. As far as birth records go, I was unable to find any birth records for John, their first son, who was born in 1818, or for either of the first 2 daughters that were born within a few years of John's birth. Now, their second son, Thomas, was born in the year 1822, and the record of his birth and christening I did find in the records of Gorbals Parish, which is another section of Glasgow. It seems to me to be likely that Joseph and Rosanna, shortly after they were married, moved from Parkhead and the coal mine where Joseph was working down to around Palmady and another coal mine down in the area down there. Now, the fact that John is listed on the census as being born elsewhere in Scotland than Lanarkshire may not be as big a deal as it might seem to be. Now, if we take a look at a couple of maps of Glasgow and the environs from around that time, I can show you what I'm talking about. First of all, let's take a look at the larger picture for anybody who may not be familiar. Scotland sits in the northern part of the United Kingdom. Now, the United Kingdom reached its current form in 1707 with the unification of the parliaments. The UK consists of Scotland, England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Now, if we look at Scotland itself, the different regions consist of the mainland, which shares a common border with England in the south, the Western Isles that include the Inner and Outer Hebrides. Just to the north of the mainland, we have the Orkney Islands, and well to the north, we have the Shetland Islands. If we focus in on the mainland of Scotland, we can see the 3 geographic regions of the area. To the north and northwest, we have the Scottish Highlands. In the middle are the central lowlands, with Edinburgh on the eastern end and Glasgow on the western end. And in the south, we have the southern uplands that run along the border with England. There are further political subdivisions, the shires of Scotland, and Lanarkshire runs in the vicinity of Glasgow, kind of in this area here. And these political subdivision boundaries have kind of changed over time. So we'll take a look at some of the older maps to see what the area was like when the family of Joseph and Rosanna Robertson were living there. Now then, Glasgow is in North Lanarkshire, so the first map we want to take a look at is a map of the northern part of Lanarkshire drawn up by John Thomson back in 1832. Now, one of the first things we should note when we look at some of these old maps is that north is not necessarily oriented directly towards the top of the map. So we have to pay attention to some of the land features that we look at to kind of orient ourselves as to where things are. So here we have Glasgow, kind of in the northern and western part of Lanarkshire, and you'll see the River Clyde kind of runs through the center part of the city and then kind of from northwest towards the southeast. If we take a closer look at the Glasgow area on the John Thomson map, you can see the built-up urban area of Glasgow on either side of the Clyde River, sort of to the northeast and to the southwest. Now the water flowing in the river is actually flowing towards the northwest, towards the Firth of Clyde. And if we come to the east and the southeast, we will see Barony Parish. And sort of to the southeast of the built-up urban area of Glasgow, the river takes a big sharp bend, and just to the northeast of that bend, we will see Parkhead. And this is where Joseph and Rosanna were residing at the time that they were married. There is a coal works nearby. This is likely where Joseph was working at the time. Now, just before the river comes down and flows into the urban area of the city, it takes an S-bend as it comes into the urban area. And sort of at the bottom part of that S-bend on the southern part down there, we will see the area of Palmady. And this is where the family was living at the time of the census in 1841. If we look at the area inside this thinner blue line that runs around to the south of the urban area on the southern side of the southwestern side of the Clyde River, we can see the area of Gorbals Parish. And this was where the birth record of Thomas was at the Church of Scotland records in Gorbals Parish. Now, this thicker green line that kind of runs along to the south and southwest of Gorbals is the county of Renfrew. So this is Renfrewshire over here. And there's a little protuberance that kind of comes in and runs right up to the area of Palmady, to the south of the urban area of Glasgow here. So depending upon which street you lived on, and sometimes even which side of the street you lived on, you could have either been in Lanarkshire or in Renfrewshire. Now, since most births were done at home in this time, depending on exactly where the family was living, when their first son John was born, he may have been actually born in Renfrewshire, but still in the Palmady area where Joseph was working in the coal mines down in this region. It may well explain why John is listed on the 1841 census as being born elsewhere in Scotland than Lanarkshire, while the rest of the children are listed as being born in Lanarkshire. It's possible that the family moved to different housing after they started having children, and the rest of the children were born in the other housing, as coal miners often lived in housing that was provided by the coal companies. If we take a quick look at a slightly less cluttered map of the city of Glasgow that was prepared for the House of Commons when they were working on the Reform Act of 1832, we can see that it's oriented a little differently than the previous map. North is kind of pointed in a little different direction, up to the top and to the left instead of up and to the right as it was previously. But we can see the River Clyde flowing through the city here, and the S-bend that it takes just before it comes into the urban area of the city and then a little farther upstream, that big sharp turn that it makes, not far from Parkhead up here. So the Palmady area would be down by this S-bend going into the city, and the distance between Parkhead and Palmady would be about 2 miles as the crow would fly. Now, there were a couple of ways for the family to get across the river. There would have been a bridge, the Rutherglen Bridge, going across the Clyde right about in this area. And in the more urban area, there would have been the Hutchisontown Bridge crossing into the Hutchisontown section of Glasgow up in here. We can see pictures of those bridges from around that time, Rutherglen Bridge, and a depiction of the Hutchisontown Bridge as it was back in the day. Another good map of the era was one done by David Smith, James Cleland, and John Wood in 1822. This shows a pretty clear depiction of the Gorbals parish on the south side of the River Clyde. On this map, we can clearly see where the lands of Palmady are, where the family was living when the census was done in 1841. And going towards downtown Glasgow from there, we can see where the lands of Little Govan lie, and in particular an area called Govan Hill. Now, Govan Hill was the vicinity where the coal mine was, where Joseph was working after the family moved down into the Palmady area. Going towards the river from there, we can see the property of Hutchison's Hospital and then the Hutchisontown section of Glasgow. Now, after Thomas was born in 1822, all of the subsequent children of Joseph and Rosanna have their birth records and christening records at the Hutchisontown Relief Church rather than in Gorbals Parish. Now, the Hutchisontown Relief Church was on Hospital Street in the Hutchisontown section of Glasgow, and it later became the United Presbyterian Church of Glasgow. If we take a closer look at the birth record of Thomas Robertson, who was born on October 12th in the year of 1822, we'll notice it says the family was in fireworks. Now, one of the things to keep in mind about this time in the first part of the 19th century was that the Industrial Revolution was really picking up steam, so to speak. And what powered that Industrial Revolution was coal. The development of the high-pressure steam engine in 1800, which led to the invention of the first self-propelled steam rail locomotive in 1804, really pushed the demand for coal. Coal mining operations were everywhere around the Glasgow area, as they were around many places at this time. Coal was necessary to power the steam locomotives, the steamships, and the industries like the cotton mills that were springing up all over Glasgow around this time. The extraction of coal took a lot of labor, and the life of a coal miner was not easy. 12-hour days, 6 days a week were common practice. The coal miner's day would start about 5 o'clock in the morning and would end at 7 p.m. Coal miners would get an hour for breakfast in the morning and then an hour for dinner again in the afternoon. As I had mentioned previously, coal miners often lived in housing provided by the coal companies. And that kind of brings us back to the mention of the family being in fireworks in the birth record of Thomas from 1822. I started to wonder if maybe the family had moved away and they were working in another area for a while. Then I came across a history of the Govan Hill area, and that said that Fireworks Village was actually the name given to where the coal miners were living at Dixon's Colliery. So we'll take a little look at the history of Dixon's Colliery and how that developed and how the family may have been living at that time. In the latter half of the 1700s, there was a man named Colin Ray who was a big landowner in the Little Govan area, or Govan, as they say in Glasgow. Now, Colin Ray was the first person to undertake substantial coal mining operations in this area. In the 1770s, there was a man who came up from England, William Smith Dixon, and Colin Ray brought him on as a manager for his coal mines. Now, as the coal mining operation progressed, it tended to spoil the land around the mine for farming, and that made the land around the mine cheaper. Now, William Dixon saw an opportunity here and started buying up land around the mine that could be later used in mining operations. So William Dixon was made a partner in this coal mine. And when his partner died, William Dixon bought out his widow, and the mine became known as Dixon's Colliery. As the demand for coal increased with the onset of industrialization, so did Mr. Dixon's wealth. William Dixon built himself a house on top of the highest hill in the area. It was known as Govan Hill. But he also needed more housing for the increasing numbers of workers that he needed for his mine. And where he built the housing for these workers became known as Fireworks or Fireworks Village. It was known as Fireworks because of the steam engine that was used to bring the coal from Dixon's pit up to the surface. We can see fireworks depicted on this map from 1816 of the area. And this is where the family was living when their son Thomas was born in the year 1822. Now, 1822 was also the year that Mr. Dixon Sr. died and his son William Jr. took over. We can also see on that 1816 map, right by Firework Village, the house that William Sr. had built on Govan Hill. After William Jr. took over in 1822, he continued to expand the coal mining operations. By the 1830s, the coal mines were encroaching on the area of the house, and the foundation of the house started to give way. By the end of the 1830s, the house was no longer livable. By 1839, William Dixon Jr. built an iron works at the facility as well. It was then that the area became known as Dixon's Blazes because the fires from the iron operation would light up the night sky for miles around. Now, Dixon's Blazes doesn't show up on many maps, but we do have this sketch from probably around the 1840s that shows the iron furnaces and then the housing for the coal miners of Fireworks Village in front of the iron furnaces. We also have this hand sketch that kind of shows how the Fireworks Village and Dixon's Blazes was laid out based on descriptions from the time. We can see the ironworks, the Fireworks Village, where the lands of Palmady are, and the direction up to Gorbals and Glasgow. One of the only maps that I found from the time that the family was living in Glasgow that showed these ironworks was a map by Allen and Ferguson from 1847. And on this map, the ironworks are at the very bottom, right at the edge. So here I am back at the spinning wheel, and I couldn't help but think, talking about Dixon's Blazes, that it kind of reminded me a little of my own childhood growing up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Now, this would have been back in the late 1960s, but I remember as a child, if the family would drive into the city and we were coming home late at night to where we lived in the South Hills, or South Hills as they say in Pittsburgh, we would drive past the steel mills on Homestead and along the Monongahela River. And these steel mills would have these big flares that they would shoot out, and it bathed the whole area in this orange glow. And I always remember being impressed as a child looking out the car windows and seeing these big flames shooting out of the stacks on top of these steel mills. And I couldn't help but think that even though we were on two different ends of the Industrial Revolution between the 1840s and the 1960s, that maybe it's a little like what the kids of Joseph and Rosanna saw when they were growing up in the area of Dixon's Blazes. There is one thing I would like to clear up about the parents of Joseph Robertson Sr. I had mentioned that we don't know who his parents are. We do know from the census in 1841 he was born in Lanarkshire, but we're not sure exactly where. But in doing some of the research, I noticed that a lot of people had attributed the parents of Joseph Robertson Sr. as being another Joseph Robertson and a Mary Kennedy. Now, there is a record in the Barony Parish of a child born to Mary Kennedy and Joseph Robertson in the year 1798. In the family Bible, the birth dates of the children that we have that we can match with other birth records, being 9 of the 12, all of those birth dates in the Bible match the birth records exactly. So there's every reason to think that the birth dates for Rosanna Armstrong and for Joseph Robertson are just as accurate. Now, I did notice in the records that this Mary Kennedy and this other Joseph Robertson did have another child in 1796, and at first I thought, well, maybe the birth dates for those children got mixed up and someone just wrote the wrong date down in the family Bible. But even though the years match, the birthday and the month don't match. So I think the only reasonable conclusion we can draw is that the Joseph Robertson who was born to Mary Kennedy and Joseph Robertson in 1798 is not the Joseph Robertson born in 1796 who married Rosanna Armstrong. Although we may not know exactly who Joseph Sr.'s parents are, it is likely that Joseph's ancestors, he being a Robertson, come from the traditional lands of Clan Donachie, which includes the Robertsons. Now, the lands of Clan Donachie are in Perthshire, to the north and east of Glasgow. Those lands would run from Rannoch Moor in the west, along Loch Rannoch, to the northeast by Struan and Blair Athol, and down to the south and east through Aberfeldy and down towards Dunkeld. Now, those lands were initially granted in the mid-1400s by King James II as a reward for the clan chief at the time capturing the murderer of his father, King James I. But that's another story altogether. With that being said, I would like to take a look at the larger picture just to get an idea of the context in which Joseph and Rosanna were raising their family. By the time Joseph was born in 1796, the final defeat of the Jacobite uprising had happened 50 years prior at the Battle of Culloden. The Highland clearances were well underway at this point. Many people who had been working the land with their clansmen for many generations suddenly found themselves without a home and without a way to make a living. Many people were forced to take wage labor jobs in more populated areas, or else go overseas. The population of Glasgow between 1800 and 1850 quadrupled. It went from just under 100,000 in 1800 to nearly 400,000 by 1850. So these were the circumstances in which Joseph and Rosanna were raising their children. The children that they had were John, born in 1818, Rebecca, who was born in 1819 and died just about 6 months old. Elizabeth was born in 1821 and didn't quite reach the age of 1 month before she died. Thomas was born in 1822. In 1825, another daughter, also named Elizabeth, was born, who lived to be just over a year old before she died. Joseph Scott Robertson was born in 1827. George Robertson was born in 1829. William Robertson was born in 1832. David Robertson was born in 1834. Now, David died at the age of 7 in October of 1841. He died just a few months after that census was taken. James Robertson was born in 1836. Another daughter, Rosanna Robertson, was born in 1838, and she was over a year and a half old before she died as well. In 1843, John Robertson married Maria Ferguson, and they started their own household. Now, 1844 was kind of a banner year for the Robertson family, because in January of that year, Joseph and Rosanna's only surviving daughter, Isabella, was born. And in March of that year, John and Maria had their first son, the first grandson of Joseph and Rosanna, who was named Joseph as well. In 1846, John and Maria had their second son, James. Also, Thomas married Maria Schuyler. Quick correction, Thomas married Janet Schuyler, not Maria. Okay, carry on. And shortly thereafter, they had their first daughter, Jane. It would seem that things were moving along pretty well for the family. Joseph had been working at Dixon's colliery pretty much throughout this time. And William Dixon, to his credit, did some things for his workers. He did build a library, something that Andrew Carnegie would do later on with his money from the steel mills. But still, working 12-hour days, 6 days a week, is a hard life. And heaven forbid that any worker should get hurt, or even worse, killed, because the family would then not only have to find another source of income, but they would have to move, because at that point they're on company property. So by 1848, some big changes were in store for the family, and we'll talk about those in our next episode.